Good day, everybody. It is a pleasure to be with you today to share some reflections on the impact of COVID-19 on youth sport and physical activity participation. First, I would like to thank the Korean Alliance for Health, Physical Education, Recreation and Dance for their kind invitation to speak to you today. I have prepared this presentation in collaboration with one of my PhD students, MarijekeTaks, who is an expert on the topic. My area of expertise is in fact on socioeconomic aspects of sports. More specifically, I examine the relationship between sports, economics, and society. Initially, my research emphasized sport participation, particularly examining social-cultural determinants of sport participation, taking a sport for all perspective. In more recent years, my research focused on the socioeconomic impact of publicly funded sport events. I bring both aspects to your attention because both foci are relevant for the purpose of this talk. Clearly, I'm not an expert in COVID-19. For all of us, the COVID-19 pandemic presented a completely new phenomenon. It created a shock globally and affected all realms of life, including sport and physical activity for youth, as well as sport events. Recent studies on COVID-19 and sport relate mainly to professional sports, sport leagues, sport events, as can be seen from the example of the recent special issue of the European Sport Management Quarterly. Studies in this issue feature professional football leagues, professional women's sports, the NBA, or are related to sport events. Studies have yet to focus on the impact of COVID-19 on sport participation and physical activity, particularly for youth. A few of the first contributions related to COVID-19 and sport participation were some commentaries in a special issue of Managing Sport and Leisure. These works have covered aspects such as sport development systems, community sports organizations and structures, and community sports for persons with disabilities. These investigations and commentaries have provided important insights into the immediate, short-term, and possibly long-term implications of community sports and structures, or for community sports systems and structures. However, an analysis of how youth participants themselves have been affected by the pandemic is still needed. Specifically, an exploration of shifting patterns and experiences of youth sport and physical activity because of COVID-19, because that can provide important insights into the future of youth sport and physical activity consumer behavior. Hence, our focus is on the impact of COVID-19 on youth sport and physical activity. So when I use the word sport participation here, I really reflect the broad notion of sport and physical activity. So not just organized sport. But this brings me back to my starting point, my initial figure. So as I said, one of my doctoral students, MarijekeTaks, was going to investigate how sport events can be leveraged to stimulate participation among children. In her research, the sport events acted as an intervention to stimulate sport participation and physical activity among youth. The two events she was going to study were the 2020 Tokyo Olympic and Paralympic Games in the summer of 2020, and the second event was the 2021 Canada Games, to be hosted in Niagara, Ontario in the summer of 2021. Of course, both events were strongly affected by the pandemic and postponed by a year. This forced her to rethink her project, and a parallel approach was proposed. Rather than looking at the impact of events on sport participation, she reoriented her project looking at the impact of COVID-19 on sport participation. So rather than a planned intervention, such as the sport events, the pandemic takes the role of an unplanned intervention. She took the same theoretical approach, namely social ecology theory, to understand and help examine how COVID-19 affected youth sport participation. This conceptual approach was recently published in Sustainability. Social ecology theory posits that individual behavior is a function of the social, cultural, and built environments. It assumes that there are 5 levels in society: public policy at the political level, which refers to laws and policies at the local, provincial, and national levels, such as physical education policies; community level factors, such as the broader informal networks, accessibility of space and facilities to participate in sports, for example, urban communities or rural communities. Institutional level factors describe the institutions with organizational characteristics that affect an individual, such as offerings at local community sports centers or local sports clubs in a region. Then there is the interpersonal level, which is the individual's immediate interaction with others. And finally, the intrapersonal factors, which originate in the individual and reflect youth's preferences and past experiences with sports, for example. The forced pause by COVID-19 requires reflection, and social ecology theory provides a comprehensive framework to guide an exploration of the impacts of the pandemic on youth sport and physical activity. And so socio-ecological theory was used to explore the following 2 research questions. What is or are the potential impacts of COVID-19 on changing youth sport and physical activity preferences and trends? And how can potential shifts in future youth sport participation trends affect sport and physical activity providers in their future offerings? So before diving into the potential shifts initiated by the pandemic, let's consider the youth sport and physical activity trends prior to COVID-19. Youth sport participation trends prior to COVID-19 indicated a gradual shift in preferences from organized, such as club and team sports, to non-organized sports, such as informal pickup participation or spontaneous play and setting. And from formal, traditional, mainstream sports, such as hockey, baseball, basketball, to more non-traditional sports, or more unique sports such as rock climbing or skateboarding. So this was already happening pre-pandemic. So then how did COVID-19 affect youth sport and physical activity during the pandemic? Here you see a quote from a recent report by the Canadian Women in Sports Alliance, reflecting a quote from a 17-year-old girl who is making a statement regarding her sport participation. Basketball team practices and games canceled. Gyms closed. Can't apply for basketball scholarships. Lost chances for post-secondary scholarships and opportunities. Note that this is about organized sports and not the broader perspective of sport and physical activity, which we are discussing here. Adhering to the public health guidelines, including social distancing and staying at home, mandatory staying at home, could have led youth to do the following things. Try a different form of their favorite sport and physical activity, or try a new form of sport and physical activity in an online organized or non-organized context. Take up sport and physical activity, or stopping participating in sport and physical activity altogether. So these potential scenarios raise the question of whether these new experiences led to new future preferences. Social ecology theory can therefore help us hypothesize how these potential new experiences from youth, sport, and physical activity during the pandemic could impact future preferences, and how sport providers should respond to these shifting preferences. So, for instance, during the pandemic, at the intrapersonal level, youth experienced new ways of participating in sport and physical activity, as outlined in my previous slide. At the interpersonal level, at many points throughout the pandemic, youth were confined to their homes, shifting the social influence back to an emphasis on parents and siblings, so away from their peers, back into the nuclear family. At the institutional level, the operations of clubs would have been restricted, leading to an increase in virtual interactions and sessions online. At the community level, those in rural communities might have greater access to space for informal sport and physical activity, while those in urban areas might be limited by their lack of open spaces. At the political level, of course, we had public officials emphasizing to only leave your home for exercise. So in the following slides, I will elaborate on the implications of these new experiences for youth, physical activity, and sports participation. More specifically, we elaborate on the following 4 sport and physical activity trends in a post-COVID-19 world. Diminished participation in organized sport, but an amplified trend towards non-organized sport. Shifts in participation purposes. Reconceptualization of value from sport and physical activity. And finally, implications for sport organizations. So let's start with the first trend, diminished participation in organized sport, but an amplified trend towards non-organized sport. Well, diminished participation in organized sport was evident from a recent report from the Canadian Women's in Sports Alliance, who found that 1 in 4 Canadian girls are not committed to returning to sport post-pandemic. Note that this is about organized sport and not about sport and physical activity in broader terms. We do expect an amplified trend toward non-organized sports. We see perhaps modifications to already practiced sports. For instance, tennis. Tennis clubs were no longer to provide their programs, but we saw all the community tennis courts being used during COVID in an informal way. So youth continued to participate in tennis, but in an informal setting. Or they experienced biking and hiking with their parents, and they continue this trend post-COVID. So they tried new sports and continue them after COVID. We also propose that the non-organized exposure would help youth engage or perhaps re-engage who did not have a strong preference for organized sport to get back into physical activities. Also, the fact that they may prefer now less competing activities can provide this opportunity to re-engage youth that had dropped out pre-COVID. In summary, we do believe that youth may have a preference to continue participating post-pandemic in non-organized settings. The second trend, the shift in sport participation purposes. There you have the autotelic versus the instrumental purposes. Autotelic means participating as a means to an end for pleasure. Instrumental means participating for other or additional reasons such as health. Well, youth may look at informal participation giving them pleasure, appreciate sport and physical activity for health purposes. Shifts among parents can go from skill building and development that were important reasons to have their kids engaged in sport pre-pandemic to now shifts in non-organized sport for development purposes to give them something to do. So reasons for participation have shifted during the pandemic, and that may perhaps continue post-pandemic. For instance, a shift from largely focus on skill development to broader health reasons, and thus lifting some of the performance expectations of parents. The third trend, reconceptualization of values. Here we propose that sport and physical activity consumers may have created new expectations of organized sport opportunities. So new expectations can include diminishing value on competition, out of town tournaments, which require a lot of travel from the whole family or some parents, and less informal programming. This means that organizations need to rethink how to mobilize resources to provide value to their consumers and satisfying experiences. And of course, this leads into the fourth trend, looking at how sport organizations will have to adapt, or the implications for sport organizations after COVID-19. Well, they may have to rethink their programming, their marketing, and their resource management. When it comes to programming, probably less organized structures, non-league centered, drop-in programming, more introductory programming, not emphasizing competition, particularly for older ages who had lapsed from sport participation pre-pandemic. Innovative marketing emphasize fun and spending time with friends. That's what they missed most during COVID, and sport and physical activity can bring that back to them. Skill development and exercise. And then sport organizations can also think of continuing some of the online programming, so innovation in resource management. This leads us to future research. So where do we go from here? What are some of the research questions that need further investigation? Well, how did consumers actually engage with youth sport and physical activity during the pandemic? Let's find out what they actually did. How did these experiences reshape preferences and reasons to participate in sport and physical activity in the future? How are these experiences and preferences different between youth and parents? And how did the pandemic impact the dynamics of the relationship between youth and parents? And what effect does that have on future sport participation? What are the long-term implications of COVID-19 on possible shift in preferences and subsequent shifts in consumer behavior of youth sports and physical activity? Finally, how do COVID experiences and perspectives differ for different consumer groups? For instance, families from different types of communities. We think that the experiences for youth in rural communities versus urban communities was different and therefore can have different future consequences. Families of varying socioeconomic status. And for those who participated in sport and physical activity before, during, and after the pandemic versus those who started to pick up sport and physical activity for the first time during the pandemic. Social ecology theory provides a comprehensive lens to understand the complex role of the social and built environments for families and their evolving sport and physical activity preferences. So it will be a helpful tool to investigate these research questions. Georgia Tier is embarking on these research questions, and we look forward to presenting her findings in future conferences. So in conclusion, we would like to state that the COVID-19 pandemic has acted as an unplanned intervention that has affected, and it is expected to continue to shape, youth sport participation and physical activity preferences and overall trends. Specific responses are presently unknown, as specific implications of the pandemic have yet to be fully understood. Future research should continue to explore the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic in community sport, particularly on youth sport consumer behavior. With that, I would like to thank you for your attention. I wish I could be here with you today to answer your questions in person. Unfortunately, the pandemic doesn't allow to be with you. Neither does the time difference between our countries. But please, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to email myself or my graduate student, Georgia Tier, with your questions, and we will be happy to answer them. Thank you very much for your attention. It was a pleasure sharing these reflections with you.